Our last respects. Later on Wednesday, Brian struggled downstairs to his recliner chair in the sitting room. His body seemed to be collapsing. We kept chatting about what we were watching on television, so he might feel he was also involved in watching the programme, even though he couldn't see the picture. At about 5:30 p.m, the bone pain started up again, with Brian panting for breath, his body trembling. This all-consuming pain, this extreme situation was now commonplace for him. His brother John, who had finished his final exams, was home from college, and Vicky was back from Irish college. So we all poured into the sitting room together. At midnight, Brian began to watch a film. His dad and Vicky had gone to bed. Paul had work in the morning, so he had gone too. I told our son John, who was also watching the film along with Brian, that I'd get some sleep while it was on, and to call me when it was over and I'd put Brian to bed. At 1:30 in the morning, John woke me to say, "Mum, you sleep on for another bit. I'll get Brian to bed and stay with him a while." John was so gentle. I knew well the ritual of the 4 different mouthwashes Brian used before he went to sleep to help prevent infections in his bleeding gums. I knew also that his dad had been checking on him, so I fell asleep. A little over 3 hours later, at 4:45 a.m, I woke up and I went straight into Brian. "John, you go on to bed now, love. I'll sit with him," I said to my eldest. So I sat there, as I did so many nights, enduring this Chinese torture of watching my child panting for breath and trembling with pain. The pain that began at 5:30 the evening before was still tearing through Brian. I settled into the rhythm of that noisy struggle for each breath, but it took me a moment to notice that there was a difference. There was a rattle also. I've never been with a dying person, but I'd heard about this death rattle. So what to do? Nothing. We wanted Brian to die at home. There was no point in calling anyone. Everyone was punch drunk with exhaustion. No one could do anything. This could take a very long time, days even. Better let everyone sleep, I decided. Anyhow, we couldn't alarm Brian by having us all sitting round his bed at 5 in the morning. So I just sat there. I sat there with my baby. I listened to his breathing, his death rattle. I wiped away the few sneaky tears that filled my eyes. I had a word with Michael, the Archangel, and reminded him to be close. I trusted him not to let me down. I didn't know what I was supposed to do, or how I was supposed to do it. I tried to be in the moment the best that I could and stick with my plan. Carry on like nothing was different, so Brian would not be alarmed and remain peaceful. What else could I do? I was so scared. What if he realised he was dying, leaving all of us? What would dying actually be like for him, or for me? On the odd occasions that Brian opened his eyes, we smiled at each other, like I did every day. I rubbed his hands, touched his face and his hair, and I massaged his aching body. I watched as a yellow flush began in his chest and worked gradually up to his face and then down the rest of his body. Liver failure, I imagined. I've no words to describe the ache that overwhelmed me. At 6:30, my husband John woke and I told him about the change. I suggested that Paul stay home from work and John agreed with me about Brian's condition, and the two of us just sat with him. At 8 a.m, when the doctor's surgery opened, John rang it and Dr. Joe Dillon came immediately. The doctor gave Brian more morphine and an injection to suppress secretions. Brian couldn't swallow his spit and that was causing the rattle. The injection helped reduce the secretions and Brian felt a little more comfortable. Dr. Dillon phoned the hospice nurse from our house, asking her to call over to Brian, and he left a prescription for us for more medications for the nurse to administer. John was anxious to have every possible medication available and was waiting at the pharmacy door when it opened for business. Some weeks before, I'd given a list of phone numbers to my friends Anne and John of the various people to call when it would become necessary. I didn't think that my loved ones or I would benefit from me making this call personally. The time had come for Anne and John to make those calls. So I phoned them and told John that Dr. Dillon had confirmed with us that Brian was now dying. At about 9:15, Brian needed to go to the loo. He sat on the edge of the bed. I stood in front of him and tried to help him up as usual, but his knees kept buckling. "I'll get you the pigeon," I said. The pigeon is our local word for the portable urine bottle. "No, I'll be able to walk," he insisted. I tried to help him, but I was too small and he had no power at all in his legs. I shouted for Paul, who was at his side in an instant. We held him under both shoulders. My legs won't hold me up for some reason, Brian said. There was no anger in Brian's voice. He couldn't see, he couldn't walk. These were just circumstances that he noted, and then he ignored them and worked around them. Maureen, our neighbour, stuck her head in the open door and called up the stairs. She had come to see if she could help, having gotten the phone call from John Lee to say that Brian was dying. Maureen, can you call back later? I called down. Paul and I got Brian to the bathroom. Then he began to vomit over the hand basin. This is it, I said to Paul. I suddenly realised that when I lifted his head he would be gone. And sure enough, when I lifted up his head and looked into those big hazel eyes, there was no one home. Deathly silence. His eyes were empty. My Brian was gone. I believed he might still hear me, so I just kept saying, I love you forever, baby, I love you forever. God bless, protect, guard and guide my precious boy. Again and again I said it, so I was able to keep my silent promise to Brian to send him on his way peacefully with all my love and blessing. I dared not feel my own emotions, the overwhelming grief and the searing gut pain that engulfed me. I dared not say, come back, Brian. Don't go, Brian. Don't leave me, Brian. Although it was on the tip of my tongue, I felt the silence in every fibre of my being. Brian had been gasping loudly for each breath. Then it just stopped. Exactly that. It stopped. The sound stopped. It was replaced by a screaming silence. A silence that was so shocking that I felt it deep down in some primitive place. This silence was overwhelming, deathly silence. My son Paul and I picked up our precious Brian by the shoulders and legs and brought him back to his bed. When we laid him down, 2 more breaths left his body. He's breathing, Mum, he's breathing, Paul said excitedly. No, Pet, Brian is gone, I had to reply. I closed my baby's eyes and told him again, I love you forever. I felt him growing colder and wondered how in God's name I was going to live without him. The sweetest thought in my head was to be gone with Brian. It was like the life was sucked out of me. Couldn't find my voice. I could barely whisper. I actually could not say the words I could not say to John and the children that Brian was dead. Paul, call the others and phone your dad, I whispered. I hated asking Paul to do such a difficult job, but he is so brave and strong, and I just didn't have it in me. A 20-year-old young lad hugging his dead brother, it's a sight you never want to witness. Paul woke Vicky and John and they came straight away to Brian's bedside. He then phoned to tell his dad the terrible news. He was at this point just getting into his car outside the local chemist to go to the hospital pharmacy in the hope of getting the new prescription filled there for Brian. I vaguely wondered why John had taken so long getting the prescription filled. It transpired that the medicine was not in stock and he was delayed while they checked other pharmacies. John came home to his dead child and could only sob from the very depths of his being, wordless. We spent a long time as a family with Brian, finding our voices to whisper to him that we loved him. We quietly touched him, feeling his hair that had become thin and wiry, kissing his lips to say goodbye. It was so shocking to get that cold, non-response. This was a very surreal situation. Mum, Dad, brothers and sister around a dead young man in the bed, sunshine pouring through the window, just quietness. John and I holding it together for the sake of the children. There was no need for words to communicate how we felt. We were shocked and desolate, trying to steady ourselves and hold on to that last bit of warmth as it left our Brian's body. Eventually, John said that we had to call the doctor. Why? I asked. For a death cert, he pointed out. I'd forgotten all about that, but yes, of course, the doctor and priest had to be called. Father Nine anointed Brian, and Dr. Michelle Dillon came to the house. It was now about 10:30 a.m. The hospice nurse called around. It was difficult to find the words for her, so I just said, sorry, Brian died. He doesn't need you now. She offered to lay Brian out, and she and Dr. Michelle laid him in his bed, hands joined. They took over cleaning the bathroom floor from John. Dr. Joe Dillon phoned to know if we were okay. The pain is all ours now, was my response. I phoned my friends John and Anne, and now John made the final calls for me. I still couldn't speak of this horror, could not put words on it. Paul phoned Patrick, Brian's friend, asking him to let the others know that Brian was gone. Brian died on the morning of Thursday, June 28th. It came to mind that a few short months ago, on February 28th, when he had been too sick to go to the Soccer International in Dublin, we didn't even know what was wrong with him then. Little did we know what lay ahead for us all. We needed to make funeral arrangements. It just followed that we would lay our Brian out at home, have his wake in his own house. It was where he belonged. We were all in this together, so John phoned O'Connor's funeral home. Kevin, the undertaker, who was very sensitive to our situation, came straight out to the house to discuss the arrangements with us. We agreed the funeral arrangements with him. Brian would be waked at home. The rosary would be that Thursday night at 8 o'clock. The removal at 8 o'clock the next night, and the funeral mass at 11 o'clock on the Saturday morning. Following the mass, Brian would be buried in St. Oliver Cemetery nearby. We'd no trouble agreeing on a casket, the one with the carving of the Last Supper. We had shared everything. We had all eaten together at the table, broken the bread of suffering, and faced death together. And then we had to pick out clothes in which he was to be laid out. There was immediate agreement on the Celtic jersey. Brian had a very special jersey. Colin Healy, a Celtic football player, had heard Brian was sick and sent him the original jersey that he had worn in the 1999 Celtic vs Rangers Cup final. Can you believe that? Think of the monetary, not to mention the sentimental value, of such an heirloom. This was followed by agreement on the new grey tracksuit trousers that Paul's girlfriend Valerie had picked out for Brian's birthday, and for practical reasons some underwear. Valerie was a kind and considerate angel who had visited Brian every day of his illness, often more than once a day. All too soon, the undertaker's hearse pulled up outside of our front door and the patio door came out again. Last time we needed to take the patio door out, I recalled. We were bringing in that comfortable recliner chair for Brian. The funeral home staff advised us to stay in the living room, while they brought our Brian's body out in the black plastic body bag to the hearse. For the first time, we were alone, without our Brian. Despite our broken hearts, there was a sense of peace. We had achieved our goal. Brian had died without the emotional trauma of knowing that he was leaving all his loved ones behind. There had been no fear. He had just slipped away in the bosom of his family. The next job was getting Brian's room ready. We would lay him out there when the undertaker brought his body back later for his wake. Prior to his illness, Brian always shared the room with Paul. We never removed the other bed throughout the illness, so it was still there. Thankfully, Maureen took it and stored it in her home, which enabled us to place Brian's bed in the centre of his bedroom. Maureen also got some of those fat, white church candles for me in different sizes. Anne lent me a beautifully embroidered white bedspread and pillowcase. With the curtains closed, the candlelight flickered softly and gently. 2 magnificent bunches of lilies were sent by different people to the house, so I borrowed 2 huge vases from Ethne, Valerie's mum. The flower arrangements looked lovely at either side of the bed. By his pillow I placed a silver christening cup with a little duck on it that his Uncle Tony had given him. In it was the tag that swung from his crib in the Bon Secours Hospital announcing his birth, the 18th of the 5th, 1982, room 106, male, 3.5 kilos. The funeral mass had to be organised. Margaret, who lives on the street behind us and is a member of the church choir, offered to organise singers, and together with friends and the organist we sorted out the details. Maureen stayed up till 3 in the morning typing it all up. She used a picture of Brian from her daughter's 21st birthday party on the front page, and she placed his beloved Celtic and Liverpool crests on the back. She printed hundreds of copies. She suggested to me that we should not serve alcohol at the wake, seeing as there were so many young people in mourning. I hadn't thought about it, but of course I needed to consider the youngsters, and decided to serve teas and coffees only. We showered and cleaned ourselves up for visitors. That black dress that I had altered came out, and Maureen loaned me a jacket to go over it. The boys put on their black ties. The hearse came back, patio door came out yet again, and our Brian came home. I was so glad to have him back. He was not really gone from me while I could touch him. He looked so peaceful in his Celtic jersey. His face had been made up, which made him look so much better. We also had a sense of peace. We knew he was no longer suffering. Brian's friends were distracted, inconsolable. Brian had always told them that he was fine, and they had believed him. We were anxious that they were part of everything, and felt included. They sat around the house, these groups of young people. Later that night they visited together the places where they had used to congregate and play football. They couldn't take it in that Manny was gone. They were left behind, alone, bereft. That Thursday was a very long day. From early on, people called and stayed in our front room. Sandwiches, apple tarts and scones appeared from so many kind hands, and the dining room table was laden with food. Mary and my sister-in-law made sure everyone had tea and coffee, and had her daughters on duty, collecting the tableware, washing it, and getting it ready for the next callers. It was so unreal, though, bringing someone to the kneelers at the end of the bed, so they could pay their last respects to Brian, who was lying in the soft candlelight. His dad, John, said he found it impossible to describe his emotions during the hours leading up to the rosary, as well as the day of the removal, with any clarity. Lying in bed during that Thursday afternoon and looking out the window on a very fine day, with birds singing and the wind rustling the leaves, he was actually emotionless, numbed. We checked every so often on our boy. There was blood coming from his mouth, so we phoned the funeral home. Kevin came to the house and said that they would have to take Brian away and drain fluids. They would have him back for the rosary. So the hearse and the black bag job had to be done again. There seemed to be little respite from trauma for this body. So many people called, kind and caring people, family and friends from near and far. Neighbours offered accommodation for visiting relatives. The many kindnesses enveloped and supported us. In a couple of hours the hearse pulled up, and Brian was back at home in time for his own rosary. Father Nyan led the prayers and used his microphone and speakers to reach the throngs filling the garden and spilling out onto the park outside. After the rosary we settled down for the night. Valerie never left our Brian alone. "Is Brian alone?" she would inquire if she saw someone leave, and she'd bound up the stairs to sit with him. Paul also spent a lot of private time with Brian, having his own final conversation with the brother he had cherished so dearly, as did John and Vicky. We all had our final things to sort out with Brian, the things we couldn't say while we were pretending he was going to live. Brian bled again. I packed his nose with cotton wool, but it was soon soaked. His eyes and mouth bled and there was a hissing noise. When he was sick, every time we saw blood we were full of fear that he would bleed to death. This time it was easy, there was no fear. I wrapped his head in the black towels I had purchased to soak the blood. There were towels on the pillowcase and under his chin to save the shirt until morning. Never heard of such a thing happening. Everything relating to Brian's illness was new to me. However, I liked that I could still do something for him, still be his mum, and I wished I could have known more, been more prepared, been less traumatised and shocked by unfolding events. I was so tired, so physically and emotionally exhausted. I needed to get to bed at a reasonable hour and get some sleep. I was afraid that I would not be able to muster enough courage and strength to face the day ahead, but I owed it to Brian to do what was right by him. There wasn't much sleep in the end, as there was so much to do. Tidy the house and have a quiet cup of tea when everyone was gone. You're probably wondering why I didn't stay up all night with Brian. I was shattered. I was all done in. I knew Brian would not have demanded or expected that of me. I had stayed up around the clock when he needed me. Now he would not begrudge me a little sleep. I needed to dig deep, to find energy somewhere, to do what was needed for these last days with Brian. With lots of people in the house at all times, John wanted each day to finish as quickly as possible until the funeral was finally over. He felt a lot of anger, recalling distinctly, when all the crowds had gone, that it was as if the whole world had stopped. For a while, he went through a lot of self-pity, and I think it was possibly in the quietness that his grieving really started. We called the funeral home again the following morning, Friday. The Celtic jersey was blood-soaked, as was the pillow, despite our best efforts with the towels. So it was back into the black bag again for Brian. Sometime later the hearse backed up to the door and Brian was home again. His clothes had been washed and dried. As his mum, my first reaction was, "Did you get the clothes dried properly before you put them back on?" And then I realised that it was never again going to matter to Brian whether his clothes were damp or not. The intrusion of this reality was one of the many painful steps on the long journey of reconciling myself to the fact that my child had died. Brian's body still gave trouble, the bleeding starting up again. Packing wasn't enough, so for the third time our Brian went off in a black body bag, and the patio door was once again taken out and the hearse pulled up. Kevin advised us that rather than negotiating the stairs to lay Brian out in his bed, it would be better to put Brian's body in his coffin and leave him downstairs. He said something about fluids, and the less movement the better. So we sorted out the sitting room to receive his coffin. The candles, flowers and kneelers were rearranged. The hearse pulled up again. The patio door came out again, and Brian returned in time for his own removal. I can't describe adequately what it was like. Young lads stood there in white shirts and black ties, sobbing their hearts out. Boys and girls took turns to come into the front room to say goodbye, lining the garden, making this already tragic scene more heartrending. I wanted so much for everyone to get a chance to complete their journey with Brian and say goodbye in the most appropriate way for them. The words of "Hail, Holy Queen" echoed through the house out onto the park as Father Nyan prayed into his loudspeaker. Then it was time to close the coffin. We called in the army of white shirts and black ties to say farewell. We lingered in a last touch, a last "I love you." The lid went down on our Brian forever. The patio door came off one last time as John, Paul and their dad helped shoulder our precious Brian out of his home and into the hearse. That scene, my children shouldering their brother out the front door, their dad anxiously glancing to see if they were okay while he was balancing the coffin on his own shoulder. It's a picture etched in my mind forever. We walked behind the hearse to the nearby church. Supporting us was a sea of youngsters, relatives, and a huge crowd of neighbours and friends. We followed Brian as we retraced his footsteps, silently walking the road that he had travelled every day. As I walked behind my son through throngs of people on this beautiful sunny evening, I recalled how often I had walked these same steps when I was pregnant with Brian, taking him in a buggy to nursery, or bringing him to school to visit friends or to sporting events. The hearse pulled up at the Church of the Real Presence. It's a very apt name for our church, I think, as there is a real presence of good in our community. We were shown so much kindness by people of all beliefs. Again, the men in the family picked up their beloved Brian in his coffin and carried him to the altar, the same altar at which he had been baptized, the same altar at which he had made his first communion. This was the same altar where he had served as an altar boy and made his confirmation. The same bishop was standing there, waiting. Father Nyan and Bishop Buckley said the rosary, and then we left our Brian in God's house and reluctantly came home to emptiness. We didn't really want to think about the day ahead. It was enough to live each moment. We were busy during the evening planning the details of the prayers and hymns. Mary Rose, my sister-in-law, made sure that everything that should be included was included and that Brian was remembered for the person he was. Saturday morning came. It was a bright, sunny day. The black limousine brought us to Brian's place of rest, our Church of the Real Presence. Sitting together as a family, without Brian, really pained us. I was silently urging myself to keep it together, saying to myself, this is us now, this is our family now. You can cope, your children need you. Father Nyan led a beautiful ceremony. The choir began with "Here I Am, Lord," and Tony, Brian's godfather and uncle, read from the book of Ecclesiastes. For everything there is a season, and a time for everything under heaven. A time to be born, and a time to die. God has made everything beautiful in its time. The choir followed with that biblical based "On eagle's wings." And he will raise you up on eagle's wings, bear you on the breath of dawn, make you shine like the sun, and hold you in the palm of his hand. Julian, Brian's uncle and his dad's side, read from Thessalonians. We want you to be quite certain about those who have died, to make sure that you do not grieve about them. So we shall stay with the Lord forever. With such thought as these, you should comfort one another. After the Gospel, Father Nyan reflected on how Brian had lived the Sermon on the Mount. Despite all that he had suffered, he told us, Brian had rejoiced in being glad. Even when persecuted by his disease, he had always spread lightness and happiness. Reading her prayer of the faithful, Vicky recalled how brave Brian had been in his last few months. Friends took turns going to the altar to read their particular prayers of the faithful. Patrick remembered Manny for music, sport and good times. Noel recalled Brian always being ready with a funny comment and wanting a good time, saying he had given him inspiration in sickness and in health. Brian's friend John spoke from the heart. "I'm at a loss today," he said, "as I've lost one of the most generous, funny and kind friends I ever had. Rest in peace, Brian." Maureen asked for a blessing on all those friends who had been such a consolation to us. And Frank, my brother, prayed for the dead, the despairing, the sad and the struggling. At the presentation of the gifts, the bread and wine were brought up by the cousins of his own generation. A procession followed, representing the different facets of Brian's character. His beloved football was brought to the altar. Then his number 3 Wilton jersey was draped on his coffin. There was the team photo from when he was a youngster in the street leagues. In it he was wearing those football gloves that he wouldn't part with, even though he wasn't the goalie. His Bishopstown GAA jersey was draped on the other end of the coffin. There was also the vinyl record, which recalled Brian's love of music, and the fun he had, mixing on the decks and DJing. Vicky brought up a video, remembering all those family times watching TV together. Valerie, through her tears, brought up the grey top of that tracksuit that she had so carefully chosen for his birthday, a symbol of how much he meant to her. Catherine brought up a little dinky car, remembering our nighttime trip to Delphi, and all the trips to matches with Brian in the back of the car. Brenda brought up a mobile phone, remembering all those text messages she sent every day to quietly inquire and encourage us through the nightmare journey. Jim, as a teenager, played in a band called the Buds, and he had brought his own compilation, which was just about to be cut and which he had dedicated in Brian's memory. It was entitled Boober, in remembrance of the many times Jim had joked with Brian over the fact that his dad and I called him Boober from Fraggle Rock as a pet name. The choir sang, "I will never forget you, my people," and the sign of the peace was followed by "Bind us together, Lord." "Freely, freely" was the hymn that accompanied communion. Brian's very sensitive brother and my eldest John read "When I Leave You" as a reflection after communion. "Family and friends, I am about to leave. My last breath does not say goodbye, for my love for you is truly timeless. I leave myself to your memory with love. I leave my thoughts, my laughter, my dreams to you whom I have treasured. I give you what no thief can steal, the memories of our moments together, those tender, love-filled moments. The successes we have shared, the hard times that brought us closer together, and the roads we have walked side by side. I leave you a solemn promise that after I am home in the bosom of God, I will be present in the communion of saints. Whenever and wherever you call on me, my spirit will be drawn to you by the magnet of our love. Whenever you are in need, call me. I will come to you with my arms full of wisdom and light to open your blocked paths, to untangle your knots, and to be your avenue to God. And all that I take with me as I leave you is your love, and the millions of memories of all that we have shared. So fear not, nor grieve at my departure, you whom I have loved so much, for your roots and mine are forever entwined. Brian's favourite music was played, and there wasn't a dry eye in the church when you two gave full voice to "With or Without You." We wanted to set Brian free to travel on his journey with our love and best wishes, but we could never give back to Brian all that we had received from him. There was so much that he had brought to all our lives. The men of the family, once again, were called on to carry Brian in his coffin slowly down the aisle for the last time, as the choir sang Brian's beloved Liverpool Football Club anthem. When you walk through a storm, hold your head up high and don't be afraid of the dark. At the end of the storm there's a golden sky and the sweet silver song of a lark. Walk on through the wind, walk on through the rain, though your dreams are tossed and blown. I put one of my arms around Vicky and my other arm around Valerie, and the three of us followed the coffin. The army of white shirts and black ties followed the family as the choir continued, walk on, with hope in your heart, and you'll never walk alone. You'll never walk alone. You'll never walk alone. As I watched my son's coffin progress down the aisle through the crowds, I recalled his happy, excited face as he and his friends walked, or rather raced in twos down that same aisle after his first Holy Communion. He was delighted with his new clothes and shoes, and he was anxious to spend some of that money burning a hole in his pocket. We followed the hearse with Brian's coffin in it, and it stopped for a minute at the green at the end of the park where we had spent so much time with his friends, playing football and just hanging out. The little stream gurgled along. The rope hung idly from the tree that just leaned across the water. How often had I washed clothes and dried out runners when the children had fallen into the water? It was all such innocent fun. God, how I wished for those carefree moments back. It's so much easier to follow the hearse than it was to follow his wheelchair, I remarked to my family. Everyone agreed. Brian was out of pain now. We arrived at St. Oliver Cemetery and followed the same ritual, the men carrying the coffin, Val, Vic and I leading the crowd. Silence. You could hear a pin drop. The air of sadness and respect was palpable. Our procession wound its way to the open grave. The sun warmed us, as it might on any other summer's day. Last prayers were said, and we gave Brian's coffin a final kiss. Brian's dad and brothers did the last thing they could do for him on this earth. They fed the rope through their hands that gently lowered our precious Brian into the darkness below. We took one last lingering look at the coffin, with its shiny brass plate which simply read, Brian O'Mahony, R.I.P. The green mat of artificial grass was pulled across, and a huge number of wreaths were piled on top. There was nothing of our Brian to see any more, nothing to touch, nothing more we could do for the one we loved so dearly and had lost. Silent. No one moved. After the longest time, the few people that hadn't shaken our hands came forward to sympathise. The crowd was loath to move. Eventually, we left the graveyard that was still crowded with silent mourners. We had invited all who could to the tennis village afterwards for something to eat. It was such a suitable venue. Brian had played so much tennis there with us as a family and with his friends. I could barely say goodbye to the youngsters as I left the tennis village, knowing this chapter of life was now closed forever. Nothing could ever be the same.